The arrival. The day Susan arrived at our home was the day I realized how different our worlds could be. I was 13 cycles old, just entering what humans might call teenage years, though I doubt they have anything comparable to a Korak's glandular development phase. My fur was changing from its kit silver to the deeper azure that marked maturity, and my attitude was probably just as volatile as my hormones. "This is Susan," Father announced, his tail curled in what I recognized as forced enthusiasm. "She'll be taking care of the household now that Alenka has retired." I remember staring at her with all four of my eyes, trying not to show my dismay. She was tall, frighteningly so, and her skin was exposed in a way that made my fur stand on end. No proper fur, no tail, and those eyes, those forward-facing predator eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. She wore what I later learned was called a dress, though to me it looked like she had wrapped herself in geometric patterns that did nothing to hide her alien nature. "Hello, little ones," she said in broken Korak, her mouth moving strangely around our words. "Susan, very happy meet you." My younger sisters, Mika and Isanki, huddled behind me, though I could sense their curiosity. Isanki, especially, seemed fascinated by Susan's strange appearance, her tiny claws clicking against the floor as she shifted for a better view. "Why doesn't she have proper fur?" Mika whispered loudly, causing our middle mother to hiss in disapproval. "Children," Senior Mother said, her voice carrying that particular tone that meant we were to be on our best behavior, "Susan comes highly recommended from the Interspecies Employment Bureau. She has experience with Korak families and understands our customs." I wasn't convinced. How could this alien, this human, understand anything about us? She couldn't even speak properly. I watched as she attempted to bow in the traditional greeting, her rigid spine making the movement appear more like a broken branch than the fluid curve it should have been. But as the days turned into weeks, Susan began to show us just how adaptable humans could be. She learned our daily routines with remarkable speed, memorizing each family member's preferences with an efficiency that even Alenka hadn't managed. She figured out that Father preferred his morning meal served with the grains separate from the sauce, that Middle Mother needed her work clothes pressed in a specific way, and that Junior Mother's sensitive nose required special attention to cleaning products. The first time I saw her strength, it startled me. She was rearranging the furniture in the common room, a task that usually required at least 2 adult Koraks, and she did it alone, moving our heavy stonewood chairs as if they were made of foam. When I asked her about it, she explained that humans evolved on a planet with higher gravity than ours, making them naturally stronger in our environment. "Earth gravity more," she said, demonstrating by lifting another chair. "Susan strong here. Help family." It was the first time I'd felt something other than disdain for her presence. Curiosity, perhaps. The idea that she came from a world so different from ours that it had shaped her very body into something alien was fascinating, though I tried not to show it. My attitude began to shift further when she handled Isanki's first major crisis. My youngest sister had always been afraid of the dark, convinced that the legendary Shade Eater was waiting to consume her shadow. One night, her nightlights malfunctioned, plunging her room into darkness. Her screams brought the entire household running, but it was Susan who reached her first. Instead of simply replacing the lights or dismissing Isanki's fears, Susan did something unexpected. She pulled out a strange device from her room, what she called a flashlight, and showed Isanki how shadows worked. She made shadow puppets on the wall, turning the frightening darkness into a source of entertainment. She taught Isanki how to make shadow animals with her own hands, explaining that if you could control shadows, they couldn't hurt you. "See?" Susan said, making what looked like a bird with her strange, long-fingered hands. "Shadow friend, not enemy. You make shadow dance, you stronger than any Shade Eater." Cultural clashes and first understanding. The first major clash between Susan and our household came during the Festival of Ascending Moons. It wasn't entirely her fault. No one had thought to explain the significance of the ritual cleaning that preceded the festival. In human terms, imagine someone accidentally using a sacred ceremonial bowl as a common serving dish. That's essentially what Susan did when she used our family's ancestral grooming brushes to clean the kitchen floor. I found her doing it and nearly had a cardiac arrest. "Those are sacred!" I shrieked, all four eyes wide with horror. "They're for the festival. They've been in our family for 7 generations. Susan's reaction surprised me. Instead of defending herself or making excuses, she immediately stopped what she was doing. Her face turned a different shade, what I later learned was called blushing, and she carefully set the brushes down. "Susan, not no," she said quietly. "Please teach proper way." It was the first time anyone had asked me to teach them anything important. Usually, I was the one being lectured about proper behavior and traditions. Something shifted in that moment. Perhaps it was the genuine remorse in her strange, two-eyed face, or the way she sat down on the floor, a very uncomfortable position for humans, I later learned, to listen to my explanation. For the next hour, I found myself explaining not just the proper use of the grooming brushes, but the entire festival of ascending moons. Susan listened intently, asking questions that showed she was truly trying to understand, not just avoid future mistakes. "So brushes connect family past to now?" she asked, her limited Korak actually helping to distill the concept to its essence. "Yes," I replied, surprised by her insight. "When we groom each other during the festival, we're connecting with every generation that used these brushes before us." Susan nodded thoughtfully. "Humans have similar. Not brushes, but items from ancestors. Very precious." Susan understand now. That conversation marked a turning point in our relationship. I began to notice other things about Susan that I'd overlooked before. Like how she'd learned to cook our traditional foods not from recipes, but by watching cooking videos and practicing late at night when everyone was asleep. I discovered this one evening when I came down for a drink and found her attempting to make summer nut cakes, Olenka's specialty that I'd been missing. The kitchen was a mess, and the nut cakes looked nothing like Olenka's perfect creations, but Susan's determination was impressive. She had flour in her head fur, what humans call hair, and batter on her clothes, but she kept trying. "Miss Airy," she said, startled when she saw me. "Susan practice. Want make good food for family." I should have been annoyed at the mess, but instead, I found myself picking up a mixing bowl. "You're doing it wrong," I said, but without my usual condescension. "The batter needs to be whipped with all 4 arms to get the right consistency." "Oh, right. Well, I suppose we'll have to adapt the technique." That night, Susan and I created what we later called human Korak fusion nut cakes. They weren't traditional, how could they be, made with only 2 arms? But they had their own charm. We added some earth spices Susan had brought with her, after carefully checking they were safe for Korak consumption, and the result was interesting. Not better than Olenka's, but different in a way that wasn't entirely bad. My sisters found us in the kitchen, laughing over our creation, and soon joined in. Even Isanki, usually so shy, wanted to help. Susan lifted her onto the counter so she could reach the mixing bowls, and showed her how to make patterns in the batter. The real surprise came when my junior mother walked in. I expected her to be angry about the mess and the waste of ingredients. Instead, she stood in the doorway, watching us with all 4 eyes crinkled in what I recognized as amusement. "Well," she said, "it seems Susan has managed what none of us could, getting Ari to willingly spend time in the kitchen." I started to bristle at the comment, but then I caught Susan's eye. She was smiling, but not in a mocking way. There was something else in her expression, pride, maybe. Not in herself, but in me. The next few weeks brought more cultural exchanges. I learned that humans had something called music, that was very different from our harmonic humming. Susan brought out a device that played recordings of Earth songs, and while most of them sounded like chaos to our ears, some had rhythms that resonated with our natural body frequencies. In return, I found myself explaining things I'd always taken for granted. Why we needed 4 arms for proper ceremonial dances. Why our architecture favored spiral patterns. Why we kept our sleeping rooms humid while the rest of the house was dry. Susan's questions made me think about my own culture in ways I never had before. Why did we do things certain ways? Some traditions had practical roots I'd never considered, while others were purely cultural, no more logical than some of Susan's human habits that had seemed so strange to me initially. The biggest challenge came when Susan had to handle her first molt day celebration for Mika. Among Koraks, the first molt of adult fur is a significant milestone, but it's also intensely private. Only family members are usually present, as the molting Korak is particularly vulnerable during this time. Having Susan there was unprecedented, but we needed her help. Both father and all 3 mothers had important government meetings they couldn't reschedule, something about trade negotiations with another species, and someone had to help Mika through the process. I watched Susan prepare for this responsibility with an intensity that surprised me. She studied everything she could find about Korak molting, practiced the special massage techniques needed to help loose fur release painlessly, and even learned the traditional molt songs, though her human vocal cords couldn't produce all the correct frequencies. Part 3, The Crisis. The day everything changed started normally enough. Susan was helping Isanki with her morning grooming while I pretended not to watch from behind my study tablet. It still amazed me how my littlest sister, once so skittish around our human housekeeper, now practically purred when Susan brushed her fur with those strange, long fingers. None of us could have predicted what would happen when the emergency alert system suddenly blared through our home's communication systems. The piercing sound made all of us Koraks flatten our ears, but Susan's reaction was different. She immediately pulled Isanki close, her body tensing in what I would later recognize as a protective stance. Alert, atmospheric containment breach detected in residential section 7, the system announced in both Korak and Standard. All residents must proceed to designated shelter areas immediately. This is not a drill. Section 7, that was our section. Our home was part of the massive enclosed city that protected us from Talek Prime's harsh atmosphere. A breach meant. I felt my fur bristle with fear. Without the atmospheric containment, we would be exposed to the caustic gases that made our planet's surface uninhabitable. That's why our ancestors had built these enormous enclosed cities, creating safe spaces where we could live and breathe normally. Move. Susan's voice cut through my panic. She was already gathering emergency supplies, her movements swift and purposeful. Eri, help sisters. Emergency shelter now. But there was a problem. Our designated shelter was in the community center, 3 blocks away. We'd have to go outside, through potentially contaminated air, to reach it. I saw Susan realizing this as she looked at the emergency maps displayed on our home screens. That's when we heard it, the horrible sound of atmospheric seals failing somewhere nearby. A hissing noise that meant death was seeping into our safe haven. Susan made a decision faster than any of us could react. She ran to her room and returned with something I'd never seen before, what I later learned was called a survival kit that all human visitors to our world were required to carry but rarely needed. Listen careful, she said, her broken Korak more clipped than usual. Susan has breather mask. We'll carry Isanki. Eri, Mika, use emergency breathers from wall. She was already pulling out the emergency breathing equipment that every Korak home kept near the exits. These were designed for very short-term use, meant to help us reach shelter in exactly this type of situation. But there weren't enough. One of our units was broken, something that should have been checked regularly but had somehow been overlooked. We had 2 working breathers for 3 Korak children. Susan didn't hesitate. She pulled off her own mask and handed it to me. Susan stronger, she said firmly. Human lungs different. Can hold breath longer. I started to protest, but she was already moving, scooping up Isanki with one arm while helping Mika adjust her breather with the other. No time argue. Must go now. The journey to the shelter was like something from a nightmare. The usually pristine corridors of our residential section were filling with a sickly yellow haze, the caustic atmosphere of our planet seeping in through whatever breach had occurred. Susan led us, carrying Isanki and guiding Mika by the hand, while I brought up the rear. I could see Susan's face reddening, her eyes watering, but she didn't slow down. Later, I learned that while humans could hold their breath longer than Koraks and were more resistant to our planet's atmosphere, it was still dangerous for them. Every breath she had to take was causing her pain, but she never showed it to us children. We were halfway to the shelter when we heard the crying. Through the thickening haze, I spotted a small form, a Korak kid, probably no more than 5 cycles old, huddled in a doorway. Without hesitation, Susan changed direction. "Susan, no." I tried to shout through my breather. "We have to get to the shelter." But she was already there, somehow managing to scoop up the strange kid while still holding Isanki. Now she was carrying 2 children, guiding a third, and still refusing to take back her mask despite my attempts to give it to her. The last stretch to the shelter was the worst. The toxic atmosphere was getting thicker, and I could hear Susan's breathing becoming ragged. Her pale skin had taken on a frightening reddish tint, and her movements were becoming less coordinated. When we finally reached the shelter's airlock, Susan practically threw herself inside, making sure all of us children were safely through before she collapsed onto the floor of the decontamination chamber. The last thing she did before losing consciousness was check that both Isanki and the rescued kid were unharmed. The next few hours were chaos. The shelter's medical team immediately took Susan to their treatment area, while we were reunited with our parents who had been frantically trying to reach us. The rescued kid's family was found. They had been searching the shelter desperately for their missing child. I overheard the medical staff talking about Susan's condition. Words like chemical burns and respiratory damage made my fur stand on end. One of them mentioned that a human breathing our planet's raw atmosphere was similar to a Korak being exposed to strong acid. She had known. She had known exactly what would happen to her, but she'd given me her mask anyway. That night, as I sat with my family in our designated shelter space, I couldn't stop thinking about how wrong I'd been about humans, about Susan. I'd thought their physical differences made them awkward, inferior. But Susan's 2 arms had carried 2 children to safety. Her crude lung structure had endured toxic air to protect us. Her primitive biology had endured pain that would have killed a Korak. Revelations and growth. Susan spent 3 days in the medical center while her body recovered from the atmospheric exposure. During that time, I learned more about her, about humans in general, than I had in all the months she'd lived with us. The first revelation came when a human doctor arrived to treat her. Dr. Zhang was the first human medical professional I'd ever met, and watching her work was fascinating. She explained things to us as she treated Susan, helping us understand both the damage and the remarkable human healing process. "Your atmosphere would kill most species instantly," Dr. Zhang said while checking Susan's vital signs. "But humans evolved on a planet that went through multiple extinction events. Our bodies are incredibly adaptable. Susan's lungs are already beginning to repair themselves." I stayed at the medical center as much as possible, often doing my studies in the waiting area. That's where I overheard a conversation between Dr. Zhang and my senior mother that changed everything I thought I knew about Susan. She was a rescue worker on Earth, Dr. Zhang was saying. Specialized in high-risk environments, earthquakes, floods, chemical spills. When the Interspecies Employment Bureau recruited her, they thought she'd be perfect for Talek Prime because of her experience with hazardous conditions. A rescue worker. My senior mother's tail twitched in surprise. But she came here as a housekeeper. Many humans take whatever jobs they can get off-world, Dr. Zhang explained. Earth is complicated right now. Overpopulation, climate issues, resource conflicts. Some of us leave to send money back home. Others, like Susan, leave because they feel they can do more good elsewhere. I thought about all the times I'd looked down on Susan for her menial job, never wondering why someone would travel across galaxies to work as a housekeeper. I thought about her patience with our cultural differences, her willingness to learn our ways, her quick thinking during the crisis. They weren't just personality traits, they were professional skills she developed saving lives on her own world. The second revelation came when Susan was finally well enough to have visitors. Her skin was still red and peeling in places, and her voice was raspy, but she smiled when she saw us. Isanki immediately climbed onto her bed, all her former shyness forgotten. "Susan," I said, struggling with words that felt inadequate, we, thank you." She shook her head. "No need thank. Is job. Is family. But you're not really our family," I blurted out. "You're our housekeeper. You didn't have to risk your life." Susan's face took on an expression I'd never seen before, something both sad and determined. "Eri," she said, and I noticed her Korak was better now, though still broken. "On Earth, I learned something important. Family not just blood. Family is who you protect. Who you love. Who you choose." She reached out with one of her long-fingered hands and gently touched my fur. "I choose your family. Every day, I choose." That's when I realized something else, something I should have seen months ago. Susan hadn't just been doing a job. Every attempt to learn our customs, every late night practicing our recipes, every patient explanation of her own culture, she had been trying to build bridges. To become part of our family in the truest sense. The next few weeks brought more changes. The atmospheric breach had affected several families in our section, and temporary housing was set up in other parts of the city. Our home needed decontamination and repairs, so we were relocated to a smaller apartment. In this new space, with everyone living closer together, I saw yet another side of Susan. Despite her still healing injuries, she worked to make our temporary home comfortable. She adapted human space-saving techniques she knew from Earth's crowded cities, teaching us how to maximize our limited room. But the most significant change was in how our community viewed her. Word had spread about what she'd done during the crisis. Other Korak families in our temporary housing complex would stop by, often bringing traditional healing foods or small gifts. They wanted to meet the human who had risked her life to save Korak children. Susan handled the attention with characteristic humility, always redirecting praise to others, the emergency responders who fixed the breach, the medical team who treated everyone affected, the community members who helped with relocation. One evening, I found her teaching a group of Korak children, including my sisters, about Earth emergency procedures. She had created a simple game out of it, helping them memorize safety protocols while having fun. "See? Like this," she was saying, demonstrating a human emergency breathing technique. "If no breather mask, can hold breath longer this way. Good to know, just in case." The children were fascinated, not just by the practical knowledge but by Susan herself. They asked her questions about Earth, about humans, about her previous work as a rescue worker. With each answer, I saw them developing the same respect for her that I had finally learned to feel. Even more surprising was how Susan used this new attention to bridge cultural gaps. When some parents expressed concern about their children spending too much time with a human, Susan invited them to join the safety lessons, turning them into cross-cultural education sessions. "Different species, different strengths," she would explain. "Koraks have 4 arms, better for climbing, carrying many things. Humans have endurance, can go longer without rest. Together, stronger than alone." I watched her build connections not just with our family, but with our entire community. She was doing exactly what she had done with us, breaking down prejudices not through arguments or demands for acceptance, but through patient understanding and genuine care. Unity and acceptance. A year after the atmospheric breach incident, our household gathered for an unprecedented event, the first human Korak joint celebration of the Festival of Ascending Moons. Susan stood in our ceremonial room, now fully recovered from her injuries, though faint marks on her skin told the story of her sacrifice. The changes in our family, in our entire community, had been profound. What started as our private gratitude for Susan's heroism had sparked a larger conversation about human-Korak relations. Our government had even revised its policies on interspecies employment, recognizing that the previous system had often relegated skilled individuals like Susan to positions that didn't utilize their full capabilities. "Susan," my father said, his formal tone carrying through the room, "you have proven yourself not just a member of this household, but a true guardian of our family. Today, we wish to recognize that bond officially." I watched as my three mothers stepped forward, each carrying a different ceremonial item. Senior mother held our ancestral grooming brushes, the same ones Susan had once mistakenly used to clean the floor. Middle mother carried a newly crafted ceremonial robe, designed to accommodate human physiology while incorporating traditional Korak patterns. Junior mother held a small box containing something I had helped create. In Korak tradition, father continued, family bonds are marked by shared grooming and shared purpose. While your physiology differs from ours, your heart beats with the same devotion to this family. We ask you to accept these symbols of belonging. Susan's eyes, those forward-facing eyes I had once found so strange, filled with tears. She had learned enough about our customs to understand the significance of this moment. This wasn't just an honor, it was a formal acknowledgement of her as family. The ceremony that followed broke countless traditions while creating new ones. Susan couldn't participate in the grooming ritual the same way a Korak would, but she had learned to use the ceremonial brushes with remarkable skill, helping to groom my sisters and me with gentle care. When it was her turn, we adapted the ritual, using special oils that suited her human skin while maintaining the spiritual significance of the act. The most moving moment came when Junior mother opened the box. Inside was a pendant I had helped design, combining human and Korak artistic elements. It was made from Talikian crystal, carved with both Korak spiral patterns and human geometric designs. The inscription read in both languages, "Family by choice, bound by love." As Susan was formally inducted into our family, I thought about how far we had all come. My own transformation from a prejudiced young Korak to someone who genuinely understood the value of different perspectives. My sister's growth, Mika now dreaming of becoming an interspecies cultural liaison, Isanki overcoming her fears to become one of the most outgoing kids in her age group. My parents' evolution in their thinking about humans and their capabilities. But the changes extended far beyond our family. Susan's actions during the crisis had caught the attention of planetary authorities. They had begun recruiting more humans with emergency response backgrounds, creating special teams that combined Korak technological expertise with human adaptability and crisis management skills. The community center where we had taken shelter now hosted regular interspecies cultural events. Susan's safety classes had expanded into a formal program, teaching both species about each other's emergency protocols and survival techniques. She had even started working part-time with the local emergency response team, while still maintaining her role in our household, though now it was as family rather than employee. Perhaps the most significant change was in the younger generation. I watched as Korak and human children played together in our community spaces, neither species seeing the other as strange or threatening. They shared games, stories, and dreams, creating a new culture that borrowed freely from both worlds. One evening, as we sat in our family room after dinner, I found myself studying Susan's face, the face I had once found so alien. She was helping Isanki with her studies, pointing out something on a holographic display with those long, dexterous fingers I had once thought so crude. "Susan," I said, drawing her attention, "do you remember when you first came here? When I was less than welcoming?" She smiled, that peculiarly human expression that I now found comforting. "Eri grow. Susan grow too. Both learn. What made you keep trying?" I asked. "Even when I was so difficult." Susan was quiet for a moment, gathering her thoughts in a way I recognized from our many conversations. "On Earth, she said, her Korak now fluent though still accented, I learn important thing. When save people, not just save body. Save hope. Save future. Here, same thing. Not just job. Not just duty. Is. Investment in better world. I understood then what had made Susan unstoppable, not just her physical adaptability or her crisis training, but her fundamental belief in the possibility of positive change. She had seen past our differences, past our prejudices, past our fear of the unknown, and recognized the potential for connection. The festival ended with a new tradition we had created together. As Talek Prime's 3 moons rose in sequence, our blended family gathered on the observation deck. Humans and Koraks stood side by side, watching the play of light across the protective dome of our city. Susan led us in a song that combined Korak harmonics with a human melody, a sound that would have once seemed discordant but now felt perfectly natural. Looking at her then, surrounded by the family she had chosen and protected, I realized that the title, Beast, that I had once mentally assigned to her had transformed into something else entirely. Susan wasn't a beast, wasn't an alien, wasn't even just a human. She was a pioneer, a bridge builder, a guardian of hope. As the last moon reached its apex, casting its purple light over our gathering, I leaned against Susan's side. Her arm, one of only 2, but more than enough, wrapped around my shoulders in a gesture that had become familiar and comforting. Thank you, I whispered, for not giving up on us. Susan's response was simple, but it captured everything about why humans like her were truly unstoppable. Family never give up. Family keep trying. Always.